It is 9:30 in the morning at Buckingham Palace. The king is on the telephone. He calls the same country house in Buckinghamshire nearly every day, and a thin, unmarried woman in her 60s picks up the receiver. They argue, gossip, sometimes speak rudely to each other, and George V himself once admitted in writing that he and his sister are not always very polite to each other. That sister is Princess Victoria of Wales. By the time these morning calls have settled into a daily ritual, she is in her 60s, owns her first house, and has waited most of her adult life for permission to live alone. Her brother rules the United Kingdom and the British Empire. Queen Mary, the sister-in-law, finds her insufferable. The mother she spent 40 years caring for has recently died. Edward VII, her father, once considered her the cleverest of his daughters and did almost nothing about it. On 3 December 1935, the daily call will not happen because Princess Victoria will be dead at 67, having ruptured a vessel in her stomach the night before. 7 weeks later to the day, the king himself will follow her into the family vault at Windsor. Doctors around his bedside whisper that he never quite recovered from the loss. This is the story of a princess who, for all the bells and gowns and Russian Grand Dukes who passed through her life, became one of the most invisible women in modern British history. The story begins with a name. To understand how that name became a problem, the camera has to pull back 6 decades, to a nursery in London, and to a queen grandmother who was already furious before the baby had finished her first nap. On 6 July 1868, in a bedroom at Marlborough House in London, the Princess of Wales gives birth to her 4th child and 2nd daughter. The baby is 5th in the line of succession to the British throne, behind her father Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, her elder brothers Albert, Victor, and George, and her elder sister Louise. Her parents shuttle constantly between London and their Norfolk estate at Sandringham. Both addresses will form the boundaries of her entire childhood world. There is, before the child is even christened, a problem. Queen Victoria watches the proceedings from Windsor with mounting irritation. The naming of her son's children has already caused friction within the family. Bertie, as the Prince of Wales is known, takes a private satisfaction in needling his mother whenever the opportunity arises, and christenings provide useful occasions for the practice. The new baby is christened Victoria Alexandra Olga Mary, with the grandmother's name placed at the front. On paper, the gesture looks like a peace offering. In practice, Queen Victoria reads it differently. Her private correspondence reveals lasting displeasure that the name Victoria has been, in her view, demoted to a mere ornament. The child will not be called Victoria by anyone in the family. Within Marlborough House, she becomes Toria almost immediately, and Toria she will remain for the next 67 years, even on the lips of her future king. A name that was meant to flatter a grandmother is filed away as a courtesy and replaced by a nursery diminutive that no one ever bothers to retire. The world Toria grows into is, by Victorian royal standards, an unusually permissive one. Her parents run their household at Marlborough House and Sandringham along lines that would have horrified Prince Albert had he lived to see them. The Wales children are noisy, undisciplined, allowed to interrupt adults, and free to roam the corridors and gardens of both houses without the crushing structure that Bertie himself had endured as a boy. Pet animals wander indoors at all hours, mealtimes drift, and visitors describe the atmosphere as that of an unsupervised boarding house, run by a beautiful Danish princess who never quite learned to say no. Queen Victoria, watching from a distance, is horrified. In one of her more famous remarks on the subject, the Queen complains in her private correspondence that the Wales children are such ill-bred, ill-trained children that I can't fancy them at all. That sentence has been quoted by every serious biographer of the family ever since, and for good reason. In a single sneer, it captures the chasm between 2 generations of British royalty. The disciplined, German-influenced household of Albert and Victoria on one side, and the indulgent, scattered nursery of Bertie and Alexandra on the other. The chaos at Marlborough House stems directly from Bertie's own miserable upbringing. As a boy, The Prince of Wales had been pushed through a punishing educational regime designed by his father, and he hated nearly every minute of it. When he had children of his own, he made the conscious choice to give them what he had been denied. The result was predictable. A brood of princes and princesses developed who were warm, devoted to one another, and almost entirely incapable of sustained intellectual effort. Inside that brood, Toria takes her place in a tight sibling unit that will define her social world for decades. Albert Victor, called Eddie by the family, is the eldest. George, the future king, comes closest to her in age. Louise, the elder sister, runs closer to Alexandra in temperament, while Maud, the youngest, becomes Toria's closest confidant. The three sisters dress alike, sleep near one another, share governesses, share illnesses, and, as adults, share a tone of voice that other courtiers will eventually find unbearable. The education of Princess Toria, like that of her sisters, is a quiet disaster. The Wales children pass through the hands of a series of governesses, the most documented of whom is Julie Vauthier, and the level of academic rigor applied to them is best described as decorative. By contemporary aristocratic standards, the schedule is light. By the standards of the German royal cousins, with their lessons in philosophy, languages, and classical music, it borders on negligent. None of the Wales sisters develops into an accomplished woman in the formal sense their grandmother would have recognized. The reason runs deeper than ordinary parental indulgence, and it has a name: Alexandra. Queen Alexandra is one of the most affectionately remembered royal consorts of the late Victorian era. She is also one of the most possessive mothers in the history of the British royal family. From the time her daughters are small, she refers to them not as young women but as "my little ones," a phrase that recurs in her correspondence year after year, attached to women who are, by the time it is being written, well past the age of marriage. Alexandra dresses Toria, Louise, and Maud in identical outfits long after the practice has any visual logic. Family photographs from the 1880s and 1890s show three grown women, posed in matching dresses with matching ribbons, as if they were 6 years old. The strategy works as intended, although Alexandra never admits it is a strategy. The Wales sisters do not develop the social independence that would normally lead a Victorian princess away from her mother and into her own household, and the household around Alexandra hardens steadily into a closed system that none of them quite escapes intact. They remain attached, deferential, and emotionally fused to Alexandra in a way that becomes the defining structural fact of Toria's life. Louise eventually escapes through marriage. Maud escapes too, by becoming Queen of Norway. Toria does not escape at all, and across the next 40 years Alexandra keeps her closer with every passing season. Within the family, the infantilizing language extends into a thicket of nicknames that later writers have sometimes garbled. Snipe, or Snipey, is the name George V uses for his sister, not the reverse. Toria, in her countless letters to George, addresses him instead as Macra, often opening with "my darling Macra." These are not the words of an adult woman writing to the King of England. They are the words of two siblings preserving, deep into middle age, a private language invented in the nursery at Marlborough House and never quite outgrown by either of them. Edward VII, watching his daughter from across the breakfast table, is the only family member who seems to register what is being lost. The king privately considers Toria the most naturally clever and artistically gifted of his three daughters, with a sharper wit than either of her sisters. He does not act on the observation. No one insists that Toria be sent to a serious school, or married off promptly, or given an independent court role. The intelligence is noted the way one notes a particularly bright painting in a hallway one rarely visits. The single most scrutinized question of Princess Toria's life is also the one her grandmother had quietly predicted, more than 2 decades before any suitor was ever proposed, that she would never answer at all. Why did she never marry? Across more than a century of royal biography, that question has produced explanations ranging from cool-headed analysis to pure invention. Once the false trails are removed, the actual answer turns out to be both narrower and stranger than royal mythology suggests. In the early 1880s, a match is floated with the Crown Prince of Portugal, the future King Carlos I, then one of the most eligible Catholic princes in Europe. The proposal collapses almost immediately. The marriage would have required Toria to convert to Roman Catholicism, and the Prince and Princess of Wales, devout Protestants in public, if not always in private, refuse outright. This is not a story about the bride's wishes. It is a story about confessional politics in a Protestant dynasty, and the wedding never moves beyond the talking stage. A more developed attachment forms in the same decade with the Russian Grand Duke Michael Mikhailovich, known to his cousins as Miche-Miche. The match is real enough that family letters circulate about it for years. The Russian court eventually refuses, and Miche-Miche later contracts a morganatic marriage to a Nassau countess, which exiles him from the imperial family for the rest of his life. Toria's Russian future closes cleanly. The two prospects that come closest to producing an actual marriage are British. Both collapse for reasons that have nothing to do with the suitors themselves and everything to do with the social and emotional machinery built around the bride. The first is Archibald Primrose, 5th Earl of Rosemary, a widowed former Prime Minister, eccentric, brilliant, and immensely wealthy. His mutual attachment with Toria is one of the most heavily documented near romances in late Victorian court life. There are obvious problems. Rosemary, after all, is a politician and a commoner, not a foreign royal. And he comes attached to children from his first marriage. Queen Victoria, the future king, and the wider royal family balk at the social demotions such a marriage would represent for a princess of the blood. Nothing comes of it. The second possibility is even more impossible. Sir Arthur Davidson, Edward VII's equerry, a man whose attachment to Toria is whispered about in court circles for years, but who, as a court official far beneath her rank, can never become a serious candidate. Both relationships die quietly, suffocated by protocol. Behind all of this hovers Alexandra. The standard reading for most of the 20th century blamed Queen Alexandra for sabotaging her daughter's prospects out of what one biographer famously called monstrous selfishness. It is a satisfying explanation, and it is also too simple. Retaining an unmarried daughter as a permanent domestic companion was a routine Victorian arrangement, particularly in aristocratic households where aging mothers expected at least one daughter to function as a personal aid for life. There is also a quieter case to be made that Toria herself was not entirely the passive victim of legend. She was, at least in part, complicit in her own captivity, attached to her mother in ways she did not fully understand and did not seriously try to break. The cruelest assessment of Toria's marital future, however, did not come from her mother. It came from Windsor Castle, decades before any of the candidates had been proposed. In a letter to her daughter, the Crown Princess of Prussia, Queen Victoria writes flatly of her granddaughter, "She will never marry, I am sure. She is not strong enough." The line is brutal because it is correct. It is also brutal because it identifies what Toria's family already suspects and refuses to address that the princess is being raised in a household so structurally hostile to female independence that she will not even attempt the escape. The medical record of Princess Toria is one of the most tangled documents in late Victorian royal biography. Across her life, she suffers from severe neuralgia, recurrent migraines, debilitating indigestion, chronic colds, and long bouts of low mood that contemporary doctors decline to name. On paper, the list reads like a serious chronic condition. How her doctors handle it suggests something more complicated. Royal physicians of the period are limited in both diagnostic tools and vocabulary. Toria's stomach complaints are repeatedly written down as gastric catarrh, a vague 19th century label that covered almost everything from food poisoning to ulcers to anxiety-driven indigestion. Her nervous indigestion is treated as a separate condition, though it is plainly connected to her psychological state. The royal doctors who attend her see what is happening at the surface of her body. They have neither the framework nor the inclination to look at the structural cause. The strongest modern reading takes Toria for a serial hypochondriac whose ailments were largely psychosomatic, weaponized as a quiet, almost unconscious form of resistance against a domestic life she could not openly refuse. Her illnesses tend to intensify at exactly the moments when her mother's demands become unbearable, and they recede during the rare intervals when she is allowed any independence. The body, in this reading, is doing the work that the mouth is not permitted to do. What is not in doubt is the depression. As Toria moves into middle age, the cheerful, sharp-tongued young princess of the 1880s darkens into a more brittle figure, prone to long periods of withdrawal, sleeplessness, and weeping. Her physicians lack the language, and they do not call it depression. The condition is, in truth, the predictable emotional consequence of a life she has not been allowed to design. The neuralgia is real, and so are the migraines. As for the grief, unlike either of those, it never lifts. King Edward VII dies at Buckingham Palace on 6 May 1910, after years of declining health, and the architecture of Princess Toria's life shifts immediately. Her brother George, now George V, ascends to the throne. Her mother, now Queen Alexandra, moves abruptly from Queen Consort to Dowager Queen, and finds herself displaced from the center of the British court by her daughter-in-law Mary. Toria, who has spent her entire adult life moving in her parents' orbit, is reassigned overnight to a single, undisputed function: Keeper of Alexandra. The household reorganizes itself around the Dowager Queen. Marlborough House becomes her permanent London residence, while Sandringham, the late king's beloved country estate, is retained as her favorite retreat. Toria moves with her mother between the two. She has no separate establishment, no house of her own, and no income that is not channeled through her mother's accounts. Her mother's permission is also required for almost any practical decision she might want to make. At the age of 42, after her father's death, she is not the head of her own life. She is something closer to a senior member of her mother's staff. Alexandra in this period is, in the medical language of the time, declining. The deafness that had plagued her since the rheumatic fever of her 30s has worsened into near total loss of hearing, and the conversations she still attempts are conducted at a volume that exhausts both speaker and listener. Her short-term memory fades, and her widowhood has produced long bouts of low mood. The Dowager Queen retreats further into her household, and the demands on Toria multiply. The clearest contemporary description of this arrangement comes from Toria's first cousin, the Russian Grand Duchess Olga Alexandrovna. Olga, who knew the household intimately from her own visits to Marlborough House, later put the matter bluntly. Queen Alexandra treated Princess Victoria like a glorified maid. The phrase has stuck because it is accurate. Olga goes on to describe the small, exhausting daily details. Alexandra ringing her bell from any room of the house and expecting Toria to appear instantly, the Dowager Queen keeping her daughter on permanent standby, the household assuming Toria's presence as a default rather than as a courtesy that might be declined. Sir Frederick Ponsonby, a court official under both reigns, corroborates the picture. In his private notes, Ponsonby records moments at which Alexandra rang the bell only to ask Toria to fetch an object that already lay within Alexandra's reach. The request was not really about the object. It was about confirming, with a quiet ringing of the bell, that the daughter remained within earshot and on call. A pattern emerges. The princess, now in her 40s and 50s, structures her entire day around the audible authority of a small handheld bell. Almost every decision that would normally count as private in the life of a 50-year-old woman of independent means travel, entertaining, hosting, even when to go to bed requires her mother's permission first. In the conventional sense, she does not have a private life at all. The infantilization that began in the nursery has now been formalized, by widowhood, into something close to indentured companionship. There is one relationship that holds Toria together through these decades, and it does not run through Marlborough House or any other corridor of the formal royal court. It runs through Buckingham Palace, every morning at 9:30. Across his diaries, the king returns to the calls again and again, documenting the daily arguments, gossip, and complaints of a brother and sister using each other as a safety valve. George dials Toria almost every weekday during his reign. The conversations are not, by any reading, official, and they are not state business. They are gossip, family complaint, weather, dogs, illness, the latest tedium from the cabinet, the latest absurdity from a cousin. The king uses the calls the way an exhausted middle-aged man uses any such valve to vent, to be teased, to be allowed for an hour to drop the weight of being king, and to argue with his sister instead. Toria fits the role exactly. Her tongue is sharper than her brother's, and her observations of court life are funnier and crueler. She tattles freely on the king's children and grandchildren when she thinks they have stepped out of line, a habit that drives Queen Mary into quiet fury, but which George, secretly, treasures. The two of them together form something close to a private intelligence service of two, with the king's wife on the receiving end of much of the surveillance. What Toria receives from the telephone calls is harder to name. They are not a substitute for romance, motherhood, or any of the freedoms her sisters won through marriage. They are, instead, a daily, structural reminder that she is loved by the most powerful man in Britain, that the King of England takes an hour out of his morning, almost every morning, to argue with her. For a woman who has been told her entire life that she is fragile, dependent, and unlovable in the way that mattered, the morning call comes close to oxygen. Princess Toria's relationship with her sister-in-law, Queen Mary, ranks among the most poisonous documented family quarrels of the early 20th century British royal household, a feud quiet enough to stay out of the press, but loud enough to define a generation of family Christmases. The hostility has shaped how history remembers Toria. Its origins lie not in personality alone, but in the structure of the family Mary had married into. Mary of Teck is, in personality, the precise opposite of the three Wales sisters. She is shy, intellectually disciplined, deeply conscious of duty, and almost entirely without humor about the institution she has married into. The Wales sisters Toria, Louise, and Maud are loud, gossipy, mocking, and tightly bound to each other by a shared sense that nobody else in the family quite belongs. The collision is structural before it is personal. Within the royal household, the mutual contempt was no secret. The Wales sisters regarded Mary as dowdy and plodding and unbearably dull. Mary, in turn, regarded the sisters as cliquish, childish, and frivolous. She resented the way they continued to treat her, decades into her marriage, as an outsider in her own family, an interloper who had never quite earned the right to be there. It is in this period, deep into Mary's reign as queen consort, that the nickname surfaces. Courtiers loyal to Queen Mary begin to refer to Toria and her sisters as the Whispering Hags. The label is mean. It is also almost certainly accurate as a description of the social experience of being in the same drawing room as the three sisters when they are in a mood. The Wales sisters whisper, lean toward each other at family events, and share private jokes, often about Mary, which they make no real effort to conceal. Toria is the sharpest of the three. By her 50s, she has become a sustained, low-grade saboteur of household peace, a woman who knows everyone's weaknesses and who is unable to resist exploiting them in casual conversation. She tells her brother things about his own children that he should not know. She passes on observations about Mary's behavior at dinners that have no purpose except to wound. The tongue that Edward VII once thought was clever has become, in middle age, the only weapon Toria still owns, and she uses it on her sister-in-law without restraint. Mary, for her part, never confronts Toria directly. The Queen retreats instead into the formal courtesies of court life, withholds invitations where she can, and waits, year after year, for the situation to resolve itself in the only way it eventually will, which is by funeral. The feud never resolves any other way. It hardens, year after year, until it becomes simply part of the architecture of the family. For later observers, the temptation has been to read this period as the natural arc of a thwarted woman's bitterness, and there is something to that reading. A deeper reading recognizes that Toria's cruelty was the surviving residue of a wit that had been given nothing useful to do. Her father had spotted the intelligence and looked away from it. Alexandra had reabsorbed it into the household routine, and George had welcomed it into the morning telephone calls but found no real use for it beyond entertainment. There was no other outlet. The cleverness, denied any larger purpose, turned inward and then outward, and the closest available target was the Queen. On 20 November 1925, Queen Alexandra dies at Sandringham, 80 years old, deaf, depressed, and surrounded, for the last time, by the small machinery of attendants she had built around herself. The Dowager Queen has been the principal organizing force of Princess Toria's life for 57 years. With her death, the bell falls silent. Toria is by then in her late 50s. She has never owned a house, never lived alone, never run her own household, never been free of the bell. The Dowager's death leaves her, for the first time in her life, in possession of something she has never been allowed to want, an empty calendar. Within months, she does something that, for a woman of her generation and position, counts as quietly radical. She buys a house. The house is Coppins, a country estate in the village of Iver in Buckinghamshire. It is modest by royal standards, manageable in scale, and far enough from the central court to allow her a measure of privacy. She moves in, decorates it herself, and begins for the first time to do the things a private woman of her age might have done 30 years earlier: arrange her own staff, set her own meal times, plan her own day, choose her own visitors. The transformation is not dramatic on the surface. Underneath, it is the closest thing to liberation she will ever experience. The village of Iver absorbs her with surprising warmth. Princess Toria becomes, in the most literal sense, a participant in local life. She agrees to act as the honorary president of the Iver Horticultural Society, attends village fetes, and learns her neighbors' names. After a lifetime of being whisked between palaces by a mother who treated her as a fixture of the furniture, she becomes briefly a faintly eccentric royal lady who lives down the lane. Her other private passion in these years is music. Toria had always been musical. Her father had quietly noted it among her gifts decades earlier, and at Coppins, she finally has the privacy and the time to take the interest seriously. She becomes a patron and friend of the celebrated cellist Beatrice Harrison, whose recordings with nightingales in her Surrey garden had made her a household name in the 1920s. The friendship is not ceremonial. The two women practice together. In 1928, the partnership produces what is, in the small archive of recorded royal voices, an extraordinary document. A private session at the studios of His Master's Voice, with Toria at the piano and Harrison on the cello. The recording survives as a strange artifact. A 60-year-old princess sits at the keyboard, having never appeared on a public stage in her life, performing not for a court or a crowd, but for a recording engineer and the cellist who has become her friend. She plays well. The sleeve of her own life, finely cut open at the wrist, lets out a quiet, late-blooming piece of music. It is, in its understated way, the most personal statement she ever made. The freedom does not last long. By the standards of an ordinary life, 10 years would be a respectable run for a woman who had finally been allowed her own front door. By the standards of what Toria might have had, it amounts to almost nothing. By the early 1930s, Princess Toria's health, never solid, has begun a steeper decline. The chronic stomach trouble that doctors had been labeling for decades as gastric catarrh has hardened into something more concrete and considerably more dangerous than the genteel Victorian diagnosis suggested. She eats less, tires more easily, looks diminished at the family events she still attends, and writes more letters than she pays visits. Her brother, who continues to telephone her every morning, notices the change in her voice. The thinness that had once been a Victorian aesthetic asset has become, by her late 60s, a clinical alarm. On the night of 1 December 1935 at Coppins, Toria suffers a severe gastric hemorrhage that no medication on hand can stop. Doctors are summoned through the early morning hours. Her brother, The king is informed at Sandringham and prepares to travel south. The decline over the next 48 hours is rapid and largely silent. Princess Victoria Alexandra Olga, Mary of Wales Toria, dies in the early hours of 3 December 1935, at the age of 67, in the only house she ever owned. She has been the mistress of her own household for almost exactly 10 years. The calendar arithmetic of her independence works out to that. 10 years between the death of Alexandra and the death of Alexandra's daughter, ending the same way her mother's life had, in a country house with a small set of attendants present. The will she leaves behind is brief and personal. Coppins, the house she had bought as a 57-year-old woman taking her first uncertain step into independence, passes to her nephew, Prince George, Duke of Kent, the king's youngest surviving son. Such an arrangement is characteristic. Toria had always been close to George of Kent, a charming, troubled man whose vulnerabilities she recognized because they were partly her own. The estate that had given her a single decade of self-possession is handed forward, quietly, to the next member of the family who might need a place of his own. Her funeral is small by royal standards. The press obituaries are respectful and faintly puzzled, struggling to summarize a public figure whose entire public function had been to stand near her mother. The wider country, which had glimpsed her at jubilees and weddings for nearly 7 decades, registers her death as the end of one of the last figures of the late Victorian court. Inside the family, the loss is felt more sharply by exactly one person. When the news of Toria's death is brought to King George V at Sandringham, he is already a sick man. He had been declining for months. His lungs are damaged by a lifetime of heavy smoking, his strength sapped by a long bronchial infection that the court physicians have been unable to bring fully under control. His sister's death does not begin the decline. What it ends is whatever remaining capacity he had to resist what was already coming. The king's diary entry, written in his own hand in the days that follow, has been quoted by almost every biographer of his reign because it is one of the most directly emotional passages he ever wrote. "How I shall miss her and our daily talks on the telephone. No one ever had a sister like her." Understatement of that kind is characteristic of him. The grief inside it is not. He cancels public engagements. The court at Sandringham is reorganized to allow him longer periods of rest. The morning telephone, which had structured his days for a quarter of a century, has no one on the other end. George, who had spent most of his adult life as an instinctively cheerful, faintly bluff Norfolk squire who happened to wear a crown, sinks rapidly into a withdrawn, increasingly silent figure. His physicians, in their private correspondence, draw a direct line between the loss of his sister and the speed of his physical collapse. George V dies at Sandringham on 20 January 1936. The date falls 7 weeks to the day after Princess Toria's death. His last hours are managed, controversially, by his royal physician Lord Dawson of Penn, who later admitted that he had hastened the king's death with a fatal injection so the announcement could reach the morning newspapers, rather than the evening tabloids. The detail belongs to the king's story rather than Toria's, but it sits oddly close to her. The brother who had spent 25 years on the telephone with his sister was, in the end, ushered out of the world by a doctor concerned about a deadline. The two siblings are buried in the family vault at Windsor within weeks of each other. Brother follows sister into the same stone room. By then, the morning telephone has been silent for almost 2 months, and the receiver at Buckingham Palace will never again ring at 9:30 for the same reason it once did.